Following the situation at the Game Awards, we really need to address the reality of what this means for the industry and what's been happening over, we'll say the past year or so. Because it does feel like there's been a notable transition in the narrative of how Nintendo is treated among the gaming population, the gaming press, how YouTubers are handling the situation, and how, like, Nintendo is being treated going forward. And I do think with the Switch as it is now, uh, being several years old, the gaming media is now comfortable saying that the Switch is on the way out and that the new console is coming soon, as early as this year. Like we started off the year that way with them saying that like Tears of the Kingdom would be the last game on Switch ever, and then following the release of this amazing game and the announcements of all the games that are coming out after it, like they've been very, very aggressive in downplaying everything they do. Tears of the Kingdom wasn't great. Mario Wonder isn't a major title. Everything is a remake. Everything is a remaster. There's nothing new on the horizon. Nintendo is obviously gearing up to put out the new Switch next year. The reason they're doing this is not because out of like some eager anticipation for the next piece of Nintendo hardware. It is to downplay what Nintendo is doing now by overhyping audiences on a promise that was never made to begin with, right? They are doing the thing they did in like the Wii years, right? Where they're doing this thing where they start banging on about how the Wii supposedly can't run all these big games and how third parties would come flocking to Nintendo if they just put out an HD Wii and all they had to do was just give it more horsepower. Like it's the same kind of thing, right? We're seeing like the beginning trends of it, like the beginning signs of it, but they are gearing up to be increasingly anti-Nintendo, right? They went full mask off with the Game Awards, right? By nominating basically nothing, giving Super Mario Bros. Wonder no props at all, and like shafting the real objective game of the year, Tears of the Kingdom, in favor of like some absolute slop, handpicked to us by corrupt game journalists, right? Like, they went full mask off at the Game Awards, trying to convince us that next gen is here, that the Xbox and PlayStation are the consoles to have going forward, how like the Switch isn't going to be competitively viable, how like you need to replace it, how Nintendo needs to replace it, how there's nothing coming out, especially if you're a mature gamer who plays mature games. Like, that's been they're doing the same thing they've always done, right? And I'm curious if things are a little bit different now, all right? Like, I'm curious if more people are going to start seeing through this, because I have seen more and more people like speak up against like the rumors and like the narrative about like new Nintendo hardware on the horizon. It's become kind of a meme now, the Switch 2. Like, I would argue that's kind of the point, is to like make people sick and tired of hearing about the next Nintendo console before it actually gets announced, right? So like it just has like bad publicity going into it, right? Like I would argue that's part of the strategy, but like it's it is happening, I think. The gaming journalism, the gaming industry is desperately, desperately trying to get people to move on from the Switch, right? Hoping that the next Nintendo console isn't going to be anywhere near as successful, right? So they don't have to do this thing again where they're pretending to support Nintendo hardware and that they pretend to like Nintendo and pretend to like their IPs and pretend to support them, because they haven't. You can look at like what all these big AAA developers have put on Switch, and it's basically jack and shit. Like it's crazy, like to see Capcom, Ubisoft, EA, like all these major companies just throwing release after release at other platforms, having them fail over and over and over again, but like still refusing to like put anything on Nintendo consoles at all, right? And there are like endless examples of this, right? There's really no reason for like Yakuza to still not be on Switch, for example, right? there's no reason for like Street Fighter to not be on Switch. There's no reason for like Monster Hunter World or Final Fantasy 15 or 14 or any of these other games to not be on Switch, right? But there's so many like examples of games that could obviously run on the platform that are just being ignored because people honestly believe that the Switch can't run to them, right? Which is kind of ridiculous if you think about it for even like a little bit, right? But that's the narrative they always run with, right? That it's not because of like some backroom deals and like some console exclusivity contracts. It's because of like the console itself, right? The Nintendo Switch, the Nintendo hardware itself is the blame for the lack of third parties and the lack of like support for the console, and like it's just isn't true at all, right? So going into this year, like I really want people to like think about this, right? Like the Switch is well on its way to being the best-selling piece of hardware of all time. All of its games are doing exceedingly well. I'm sure Super Mario Bros. Wonder is going to exceed like 20 million units. Like Tears of the Kingdom is an objective success. Games like Fire Emblem Engage are doing well, right? They're like endless examples of like major success stories on Switch. But the narrative right now is that Nintendo is on a downward spiral. It wasn't that long ago where people were trying to convince you that like Switch sales were going down, which, as we now know, is not true at all, right? That we've seen like major success stories from Nintendo over the past couple of years, but the narrative, like, I would argue since like 2020 has always been that like the Switch is on the verge of being replaced. Actually, it was before that. Like, from the 2018, 2019 period, like the narrative was that like Switch Pro, the improved Switch that could run all the big AAA games, would be like coming out like the following year, right? So like the thing that changed from 2020 onward was like the whole like new console thing, which people started talking about, which is what they're doing now, right? And I can tell you right now what's going to happen once like the new Nintendo console gets released, which is inevitable. Well, once it gets revealed at some point in the very distant future, not next year. Once this thing gets revealed, you're going to see the same people say that it's disappointing, that it's underwhelming, that it's not what they wanted, and that it isn't going to win the third parties over. It is the same thing they always do, right? It's a trick. It's a lie. They are gaslighting you. These people are not enthusiastic about Nintendo hardware. They're not enthusiastic about the games. They're not enthusiastic about the company. And you know this because if they actually were fans, that they would still be excited to play their Switches now, today. They wouldn't be getting bored of it. They wouldn't be getting tired. They would be asking for new, interesting experiences on the Switch, not necessarily a new console, right? Like there is no reason to upgrade the Switch. I would even argue that like the Switch should continue to be supported even after the next Nintendo console comes out. Nintendo should like do something wild and different with it and then have the Switch like coexist for like years afterward with it, right? Like they don't necessarily need to have the same gimmick. Right? They could be wildly different experiences, right? They could go back to having two different pieces of hardware. They could theoretically do that, but everyone has this mindset that like, oh, the Switch is going to get replaced, which, obviously isn't going to happen considering its popularity. It's it's absurd, right? It is patently absurd, but you are seeing like we are seeing this play out in real time, right? Like we are seeing the beginning of like the downplaying of the Switch. Well, I'd say we're like middle of the cycle. Of course, like the downplaying of the Switch has been there for the beginning, but like it feels like more and more with every year, like it's starting to like seep into the consensus. It felt like early on you couldn't get away with doing this. Like but now it feels like in a lot of ways that there is like some serious like, oh, Tears of the Kingdom was disappointing. Like it kind of feels that way, right? But to be fair though, like I remember when Breath of the Wild came out and like the same sort of people did the same thing there. So maybe I'm exaggerating. If anything, it felt like Breath of the Wild was more contested than Tears of the Kingdom. But like, there's definitely this feeling that like mainstream game journalists are pushing these kind of narratives more than they did back in 2017, right? Like it feels like it was on the back burner for a long time. It felt like there was a bit of a lull, but now it's back in full force. And honestly, it's kind of weird to think this, but like this is the kind of stuff the channel was built for, right? To refute these kind of claims, these allegations. So I definitely am going to keep my eye on this situation as it develops and continue reporting on it and continue exposing it, right? Because this is a completely ridiculous circumstance, right? There have been too many high quality Nintendo games released this year that the industry has just straight up tried to ignore, right? That the community has straight up tried to ignore. And fans need to address these issues and just condemn the people who are promoting absolute nonsense over these gems of products.